In a lot of the most notorious slashers ever made, the most shocking scene is one audiences never got to watch. Across the 1980s, the genre became the most bankable product in American horror and the most closely policed. Ratings boards demanded trims to keep a film clear of an X, the rating that shut a picture out of most theaters and newspaper ad pages. British prosecutors dragged distributors into court over the tapes the tabloids called video nasties, and one of those men served real time in prison for selling a single film uncut. Parents picketed cinemas with hand-lettered signs, and studios pulled their own prints off the screen partway through a run. Much of the on-screen mayhem audiences thought they were watching had already been carried out of the room before the projector ever rolled, and one of the loudest flashpoints of the whole decade arrived, of all things, at Christmas. A man in a Santa suit was supposed to be the safest image in American advertising, which is exactly why the sight of one wielding an axe sent a particular shock through the autumn of 1984. TriStar opened Silent Night, Deadly Night in 398 theaters on November 9th, selling a premise built to offend before most people had seen a frame of it. A boy traumatized into adulthood who comes back in a Santa suit to punish the naughty with an axe. The reaction built faster than the studio could track it, spreading from local outrage to national news inside a single week. In Milwaukee, a mother named Kathleen Eberhardt founded a group she called Citizens Against Movie Madness, and the outrage she organized spread from city to city within days. By Monday the 12th, close to 200 protesters had gathered outside the Interborough Theater in Brooklyn, a Moravian priest among them holding up signs that read, "Santa's not a hitman," and decked the halls with holly, not bodies. The protests drew their force from one thing in particular, the use of a children's symbol as the delivery system for a killing. And that gave the outrage a moral clarity most movie controversies never reach. The press needed no persuading. Gene Siskel, reviewing for television, read the names of the producers and financiers aloud on the air and pronounced the picture sick, the kind of on-camera shaming that turns a film into a target. Mickey Rooney condemned it publicly. The whole storm gathered around a single juxtaposition, the holiday and the knife, and the studio had no appetite for a fight it could only lose. TriStar pulled every television spot by November 15th. 9 days after that, barely 2 weeks into a wide release, the film was gone from theaters entirely. What stung most in hindsight was that the studio had already paid the toll once. Cuts had been made before release specifically to talk the ratings board down from an X, and the picture had still ended up too radioactive to keep on a screen. The compromise bought it nothing. What came next set the template for nearly everything else on this list. The following May, a smaller distributor called Aquarius Films sent the picture back into circulation, and this time, nobody bothered with respectability. The new campaign sold the scandal as the main event, billing the film as the movie that shocked America, and daring audiences to come and see what all the fuss had been about. The very controversy the protesters had set out to erase became the line the marketing led with. A film that survived 2 weeks in studio hands found a much longer second life as the one too dangerous to leave alone. And the campaigners who had driven it out of theaters had, without intending to, written its advertising for it. There is a kind of censorship that quietly lifts a few seconds out of a film and lets the rest through. The British Board of Film Classification chose a far stranger course with this one. Its director, James Furman, declined to issue the New York Ripper a cinema certificate on any terms, and rather than negotiate cuts, he instructed the distributor to put the print on a plane and send it back to Italy, removing the problem from the country instead of editing it. The reasoning was practical as much as moral, since an obscenity prosecution was a genuine risk and exporting the film sidestepped it. A legend grew up around the decision, claiming the reels were escorted out of Heathrow under police guard. And while fan retellings have polished that detail over the years, it captures the official mood exactly. Expelling the film outright was treated as cleaner than the usual business of cuts and certificates. By the standards of the people objecting, the picture had earned its treatment. A giallo in the Italian tradition. It followed a killer who taunted the police in a strangled, almost cartoonish duck-like voice while murdering women across Manhattan, and it lingered on the violence done to its female victims with a relish that even hardened critics found hard to defend. One murder sequence in particular became the reason most often cited for keeping it off British screens. The effective ban then held for close to 2 decades. When the distributor Vipco finally guided the film past the board in 2002, 22 seconds of that sequence were still removed, cut to satisfy the guidelines the board reserves for its most disturbing material, a category it has always policed far more strictly than ordinary screen violence. Other countries arrived at similar verdicts by different routes. American theatrical prints lost around 4 minutes, though the cuts there targeted the racier material while the violence was largely left intact, an inversion of British priorities that says a good deal about each country's particular anxieties. Australia, Norway, and West Germany all kept the film effectively unavailable for years. Even the British release that eventually made it through arrived incomplete. The contested footage still missing, the version its director actually shot never quite reassembled for the public. Plenty of films on this list were eventually restored and reissued in full once the controversy faded. This is the one whose case never properly closed. In the spring of 1982, copies of a cheap, regionally shot Utah slasher began appearing on the pre-certificate video shelves of British rental shops, distributed by a minor outfit called Video Releasing Organization. At that point, it was just another low-budget import filling out the racks. 18 months later, it was a named target. In October 1983, the Director of Public Prosecutions placed it among the titles being pursued as obscene. And once the Video Recordings Act took effect in 1984 and put the whole market under formal classification, renting or selling it legally anywhere in Britain became impossible. Then, it simply disappeared for 24 years. With no studio behind it and no distribution muscle to mount an appeal, the film had no realistic way to fight its way back onto the shelves. So it dropped out of legal circulation and stayed out while the panic that had swept it up moved on to louder targets. The same title drew an R18 classification in New Zealand for its violence, keeping it in adult-only territory there as well. It did not resurface legally in Britain until 2007, when the label Film 2000 finally issued it complete, and the certificate it received on the way back is the part of the story that lingers. That certificate was a 15, the mildest adult rating the British system offers, the same band routinely handed to ordinary mainstream thrillers. Reviewers who finally caught up with the film tended to agree that its on-screen violence is genuinely mild, a long way short of the atrocity its reputation had spent a quarter-century promising. Almost all of its outlaw status, it turned out, was manufactured outside the film entirely, by the alarm that formed around it, the rumor and the list and the headlines all feeding on a picture that barely justified a raised eyebrow. Quite what the British state had spent 24 years keeping off its shelves, almost nobody who eventually sat through it could say. 72 titles made up the list that the Director of Public Prosecutions was prepared to drag through the courts as obscene, and Unhinged sat among them in a position that made very little sense. The board had already passed the film for British cinemas, without cuts, back in 1983, without any particular fuss. The prosecution attached itself only to the video release, which was added to the list after the fact, and from late 1983 the police began acting on it as though the cinema clearance had never happened. The body that classified films for the big screen and the prosecutors who pursued them on tape were not the same office, and the gap between the two meant a film could be perfectly lawful in one format and treated as criminal in the other. What followed plays out like an institution arguing with itself in slow motion. Officers seized tapes in raids that swept up far more notorious company, titles like The Driller Killer and The Last House on the Left, and more copies were confiscated during a raid in Wigan, in Greater Manchester, in the summer of 1984. In May 1985, the DPP quietly dropped the film from its list, which amounted to a tacit admission that it should never have been on it. That ought to have ended the matter. Instead, in October of the same year, officers swept up copies once again during a raid covering 67 other titles, as though no one had passed the correction down the chain. Different forces seem to have been working from different versions of the list at different moments, so a title quietly struck off in London could still be treated as contraband in the provinces months later. A legal, complete release did not arrive in Britain until 2004 on DVD from Platinum Home Video with an 18 certificate, more than 20 years after the cinema version had played without anyone batting an eye. The strangest part of the whole affair is what it was nominally about. Most of the killings in the film happen off-screen or in shadow, implied rather than depicted. The violence withheld more often than shown. For a picture hauled into so many police raids over so many years, it spends a remarkable amount of its running time declining to show the very thing it was prosecuted for. Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, between them about the most powerful pair of critics in America, called it one of the most contemptible films they had ever seen. The remarkable thing is that the man who made it had all but engineered that reaction in advance. William Lustig understood that the film's signature violence, a man who takes grisly trophies from the people he kills, would draw an automatic X from the ratings board, and an X meant no mainstream theaters and no newspaper advertising. So he declined to play the game at all. He never submitted Maniac to the board, releasing it with no rating whatsoever and a single blunt line of marketing for adults only. If respectable opinion was going to despise the film regardless, he reasoned, there was no sense paying for the privilege of being cut as well. What Lustig could not control was the sheer breadth of the opposition. Feminist groups picketed screenings, and a great deal of that anger fixed on the poster in particular, which showed the actor Joe Spinell standing with a knife in one hand and a woman's head in the other, an image inflammatory enough to make the protesters' case for them before anyone had even reached the cinema. Across the Atlantic, the resistance came from the institutions rather than the street. The British board refused the film a cinema certificate in 1981, and when the video era arrived, it refused it all over again in 1998, holding that line for more than a decade and a half. Australia went further still, banning the film outright for 11 months before a version with 1 minute and 50 seconds removed finally earned an R in April 1982. Britain did not get a legal uncut version of any kind until 2002, when Anchor Bay steered it through the board with 58 seconds shaved from a single drawn-out murder scene, the sequence that had alarmed classifiers for 2 decades. By then, the film's reputation had long since detached from the film itself and taken on a life of its own. One detail captures the whole era better than any single ban. Maniac never actually appeared on the Director of Public Prosecution's list of prosecuted nasties. In strictly legal terms, it was never one of them. Police in Greater Manchester and Lancashire rounded up copies during the panic anyway, acting entirely on its reputation, on what they had heard rather than anything a court had ever ruled. In the Britain of those years, a strong enough rumor about a film was reason enough to come through the door looking for it. The first few minutes look almost wholesome. A sunlit campus, students drifting across the lawn, the flat ambient hum of an ordinary college afternoon, and then a chainsaw coughs to life off frame, and the whole picture pitches over a ledge it never once climbs back up. I have a genuine soft spot for Pieces, and I want to be honest about why, because the appeal has nothing to do with the thing being any good. It is a Spanish production assembled with more enthusiasm than competence, and Film Ventures International dropped it into American theaters in October 1983 with no rating attached at all. I doubt anyone involved spent 10 seconds entertaining the idea that an R was within reach, or even wanted one. The entire point of the exercise was excess. In Britain, it landed on the DPP's Section 3 supplementary list, which is worth pausing on because it was its own peculiar legal limbo. 82 titles sat in that category, and the arrangement worked like this. The police could walk into a shop, seize your copy, and have it destroyed, all without anyone being prosecuted or convicted of anything at all. Nobody went to court, and there was no verdict to appeal against, which left a film like this one stranded in an odd kind of nowhere. It was simply unsafe to stock, so for years, it became practically impossible to rent through any legitimate channel, banished by a process that never quite called itself a ban. Arrow Video eventually released it on British DVD in September 2011, completely unedited, with an 18 certificate and, I have to imagine, a collective shrug from a board that had long since found bigger things to worry about. What I respect about the whole enterprise, with hindsight, is how completely it understood itself. There is not a trace of pretension in it, not the faintest gesture toward art, only the splatter served up without apology. The American campaign leaned into the one thing the film genuinely had to offer, which was spectacle, and it did so with what may be the single most honest piece of marketing in horror history. The line tells you the budget, the ambition, and the sense of humor all in a single breath. You don't have to go to Texas for a chainsaw massacre. Somewhere in West Germany in the early 1980s, there existed a version of this slasher, with virtually no slashing left in it. The local release, retitled Die Fork des Todes, or The Pitchfork of Death, had every gore scene cut out. It then went a step beyond, removing the sequence that revealed the killer's identity, so audiences were left with a murder mystery that never named its murderer, and somebody replaced long passages of the score with field recordings of birds and crickets. What survived that treatment barely held together as a thriller, let alone a slasher, which makes it the most extreme instance of a pattern that followed the film everywhere it went. Joseph Zito's The Prowler opened in the United States and was promptly carved up by ratings boards in nearly every market it entered, each one taking out something different. In the States, the MPAA forced cuts to grant it an R, yet that trimmed American version only ever appeared commercially on a Canadian VHS, while every domestic home video edition reverted to the longer unrated cut. So American renters and Canadian renters were quietly watching different films. The British release was cut heavily by the board and renamed Rosemary's Killer, losing a pitchfork murder, a shower killing, and several of its more graphic moments besides, and the picture also turned up on the DPP's Section 3 list, which left pre-certificate tapes liable to seizure. The board did not waive those British cuts until Optimum's DVD in 2007, more than a quarter of a century after the film first appeared. By that point, the question of which version counted as the real one had no sensible answer. A viewer in Germany and a viewer in the States had seen genuinely different films, one missing its violence and its villain, the other left whole. There may simply be no single object you can hold up and call the definitive cut, only a scatter of versions, each one shaped by whatever a particular country could not bring itself to look at. In the window of a London video shop sat a glass jar, and floating inside it, gray and faintly translucent in the cloudy preserving fluid, was a real human organ. Passers-by were invited to guess its weight, with a prize promised to whoever came closest, the kind of cheap, ghoulish street-level stunt designed to pull a crowd on a slow afternoon. The organ was a brain. The promotion existed to move copies of a grimy spree killer film released in Britain under the title Nightmares in a Damaged Brain. As a piece of marketing, it certainly succeeded in getting the film noticed. The trouble was who it got the film noticed by. Among the people who stopped to look were the police. The picture had carried a rating problem from the very start. In the United States, the MPAA had branded it with an X, the rating that effectively shut a film out of the entire mainstream theatrical circuit and most of the advertising that went with it. In Britain, the board asked for around 48 seconds of cuts before it would license any version for release. David Hamilton Grant's distribution label, World of Video 2000, put out the original print regardless, and the brain in a jar stunt all but invited official attention to come and land on it. When that attention arrived, it arrived hard. Officers seized more than 200 tapes in raids on shops across London and Leeds, and the case moved well beyond simple confiscation into a full prosecution under the Obscene Publications Act of 1959, the heaviest obscenity law on the books. That was a serious escalation. The difference between a shop losing its stock and a named individual standing in the dock, and it put Hamilton Grant personally on the hook for what his label had chosen to release. A second, smaller controversy ran in parallel, this one over the special effects. The American marketing had credited Tom Savini, by then the most celebrated gore technician in the business, with work he insisted he had never done, and Savini denounced the false credit publicly and at length. It was the sort of dispute that fills column inches and then fades. What the film is genuinely remembered for is something a great deal heavier. In February 1984, David Hamilton Grant was sentenced to 6 months in prison for his part in releasing it. He remains the only video distributor in the entire history of the British trade ever to be jailed over one of these films. Most of the other titles on this list were confiscated, prosecuted, or banned, some of them for decades on end. Only this one put a man behind bars. Most of the films on this list got into trouble on purpose by choosing to put out something a censor had already objected to. My favorite story in the whole set is the one where a distributor got into trouble entirely by accident. Thorn EMI was handling the British video release and had two versions sitting in its warehouse. The one the board had approved with the required cuts, and the original, untouched. Through what could only have been a straightforward mix-up of stock, the company shipped the wrong one. The original print went out onto shop shelves across Britain by mistake, the single thing the entire approval process had existed to prevent. The timing could hardly have been worse, because this was always going to be a film that drew a close look. It was Harvey Weinstein's first production, for one thing. More to the point for the censors, the effects in it were genuinely Tom Savini's own work, not the borrowed credit that had been stuck onto certain other films of the era. And Savini's name on the real thing meant the gore carried a craftsmanship that made it land harder. The set piece of the killer Cropsey and his garden shears was exactly the sort of sequence the board wanted handled with care. Thorn EMI moved fast once it realized the error, recalling the tapes and rushing the cut version back into circulation, but the original copies were already loose in the world, and it was too late. The company was prosecuted under the Obscene Publications Act in October 1983, and the film was added to the DPP's list alongside the rest. The fallout dragged on for years afterward. Vipco's 1992 reissue was still 19 seconds short of Savini's complete work. The board did not pass. The burning fully uncut until 2002, and American audiences could not watch the original at home until an MGM disc surfaced in the 2000s, decades after the fact. What strikes me standing back from the whole saga is how ordinary the underlying argument really was. A studio wanted its gore, a ratings board wanted it gone. The exact number of seconds got counted and recounted for the better part of 20 years. And that very same argument, the one over a handful of seconds of one effects artist's work, was about to be fought out on a far larger stage over a cheap summer camp picture that nobody involved yet understood was going to lay down the template for the entire decade to come. I've saved the biggest target for last, partly because the campaign waged against it is the most extraordinary single episode in this whole story, and partly because that campaign failed so spectacularly that it helped invent the genre we have spent this list discussing. The film came within a hair of an X. The MPAA forced roughly 11 seconds of cuts to grant Sean Cunningham's picture its R, trimming the killing of the character Annie and the arrow driven up through Kevin Bacon's neck, along with other pieces of Tom Savini's effects work that Paramount would not fully restore on home video for decades afterward. By the standards of everything else gathered here, 11 seconds is almost nothing. The fight it touched off was anything but small. The crusade had a single architect, the critic Gene Siskel, and what he did reached well beyond the bounds of a harsh review. He awarded the film 0 stars in the Chicago Tribune and then gave away its ending in print on purpose, hoping to spoil the experience for anyone tempted to buy a ticket. In the same notice, he called Cunningham one of the most despicable creatures ever to infest the movie business. The column went on to print the mailing address of Paramount's parent company, with an open instruction to readers to write in and register their disgust. Most extraordinary of all, Siskel published what he believed to be the home address of Betsy Palmer, the actress who played the killer, a step that reads as genuinely alarming from any distance at all. Later, on the program's sneak previews, he and Roger Ebert argued that the film should have carried an X outright and accused the ratings board of leniency, on the theory that Paramount, by helping to fund the board's operations, had effectively paid for a softer rating. And the punchline to all of it, the part that makes the crusade worth retelling at all, is the box office. The effort to shame the film out of existence produced the exact reverse. Friday the 13th took $39.8 million at the domestic box office and $59.8 million worldwide, set against a budget of just $550,000, a return so lopsided that it made the entire model impossible to resist copying. The Savini effects the board had trimmed, the very same kind of work that had been counted and argued over on half the films already covered here, became the blueprint 100 imitators would chase through the rest of the decade. Every protest, every 0-star review, every printed address poured fuel on the same fire. The surest way to make one of these films permanent, it turned out, was to plant yourself directly in front of it and try to block the view. 10 films and 10 different fights, all of them ending more or less the same way. Ratings boards counted out the seconds they wanted gone. Prosecutors counted convictions, and in one case, a prison sentence. Parents stood in the cold outside the theaters. None of it achieved what it set out to do. Every cut, every seizure, every sermon delivered from a theater lobby did the one thing its authors least wanted, which was to make these films matter more. The pictures that survived their censorship became the canon that horror fans still chase down and restore, while the campaigns that came for them have shrunk to footnotes and trivia. If one of these stories caught you off guard, or if there's a banned title you think we missed, drop it in the comments because the next list more or less writes itself out of whatever you flag down there. Subscribe, and you'll be in the room when it does. The surest way to keep a horror film alive, it turned out, was to try your hardest to bury it.